Well, if you've been following Cap Times Idea Fest this week, you know my name is Paul Fanland, and I'd like to welcome you to this special program that's part of this week's Cap Times Idea Fest. This is the third year that we're doing what we call a celebration of journalism, which is a fundraiser for local journalism, and I'm deeply appreciative of your generous support being here tonight to this special event. It couldn't happen without David Maraniss, of course, who has been at the center of this Thought Festival since we invented it in 2017. I've been introducing and reintroducing David all week, and he's, and I have the line down. He's a hometown hero who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post editor, a prolific author, who still summers here in Madison. We're lucky to have him here with Linda, who's here tonight with him, and we're just so grateful for him. Many of you have heard him say that he grew up with the Cap Times and grew old at the Washington Post. His father, Elliot, joined the Capital Times in 1957 and became the editor of the Cap Times, long-term and beloved editor of the Capital Times. And last night, talking with Doris Kearns, yeah, how about that? Thank you. Last night, talking with Doris Kearns Goodwin, he mentioned that his father covered the 1960 presidential primary in Wisconsin as she was talking about the Kennedy election. So 67 years later, think about this, Maraniss is still having a profound impact on the Capital Times and on the local journalism scene. So how about some applause for that? As I said, tonight is about journalism. We created this event a couple of years ago, and David has done the invitations. In 2022, he brought the legendary investigative reporter Carl Bernstein to our event, and that was a huge hit. Last year, it was Judy Woodruff and Al Hunt, similarly a great evening. This year, we have another power couple of incredible political journalists, Peter Baker of the New York Times and Susan Glasser of the New Yorker. We're really thrilled to have them tonight. Tonight's presenting sponsor is Exact Sciences, who I'm sure everyone in the room knows does groundbreaking work in the area of cancer diagnosis. I'm going to ask Kevin Conroy, its CEO, to come up and say a couple of words to the audience. So Kevin, come on up.
Well, Exact Sciences is honored to help sponsor this dinner in which we celebrate great journalism. It was in early 2017 when Paul first explained the idea behind Idea Fest to me, and it strongly resonated. You see, Exact Sciences similarly was founded on an idea, and it started in a conversation, a meeting that I had at the Mayo Clinic in 2009 with Dr. David Ahlquist, who was a gastroenterologist and researcher. And he had two powerful, if not profound, ideas. The first was we could eradicate colon cancer if we could develop a test where people could accurately be screened in their own home. The second was an even more powerful idea, which was the idea of one blood draw, most cancers. And that idea we are working on. As you probably know, Cologuard now, the first idea has come to life 15 years later. And estimates are that it has saved tens of thousands of lives and saved about $22 billion to the healthcare system. But the really cool thing is it didn't start with science, it started with an idea. And I think similarly, America represents, maybe unlike any other country, an idea of liberty, democracy, equality, and people all over the world look to America for inspiration. And the idea of America can't survive if we don't serve it, nor can it survive without great journalism. The Cap Times is a pillar of independent journalism. And we are proud. We're so proud of its work and of Paul. He is such a unique and kind and thoughtful and insightful and independent person. And it not only helps Madison, it helps the great state of Wisconsin, it helps our country, it helps even the world. So we're lucky to have Paul, we're lucky to have the Cap Times. It protects democracy. It holds leaders accountable. It roots out corruption, focuses on important, complex issues. It builds trust, stops misinformation. It gives all people a voice, and it supports our economy. So we're proud to support the Cap Times Idea Fest. It's just it's incredible what it's become, Paul. So please join me in your continued support of our strong local independent journalists by subscribing, by donating. It's important that the work continues, so thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Well, thanks, Kevin. I'm not sure it's awfully kind words. Before turning it over to David, I want to acknowledge not only Exec, but the other sponsors and partners without whom this wouldn't be possible. Epic Systems, HealthX Ventures, UW Health, the Carbone Cancer Center, Madison Gas and Electric, the Ascendium Education Group, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which has been a partner since the start, and it's represented tonight by Chancellor Jennifer Mnuchin and her husband Joshua. Could we acknowledge them? And we also have former Governor Doyle, Jim Doyle, and Jessica up here tonight, too. So let's give them a nice round of applause. I only learned after we secured Susan's and Peter's appearance here that Susan and Chancellor Mnuchin were college classmates, and so that's a small world story. As I watched the recent presidential debate, I was wondering what was going through the minds of tonight's guests, who as much as any two journalists in the nation, have PhDs in all things Donald Trump. Peter and Susan co-authored the brilliant definitive account of Trump's entire term as president, and you have an autographed book at your table tonight, and I believe they've offered to stay after to personalize autographs after, if you'd like. Doris Kearns Goodwin did that last night, and it was a huge hit. We appreciate that. Peter is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and a political analyst for MSNBC, was previously a reporter for the Washington Post for 20 years, and is a prolific author. He has covered 5 presidencies from Bill Clinton through Joe Biden. Susan writes a must-read weekly column titled Letters from Biden's Washington for the New Yorker magazine, and is also an alum of the Washington Post. I'm a big fan of her podcast, The Political Scene, which she does with Evan Osnos and Jane Mayer, who David brought to Madison for one of our sessions in 2021. The headline on Susan's most recent column about the debate was what you might call unsubtle. Donald Trump had a really, really bad debate.
But it was beautiful.
I would just note that Peter graciously agreed to stay over, and he will be on our stage tomorrow night at the Memorial Union to interview Liz Cheney. So it's going to be very exciting. We hope many of you will be there. I bet you will. When I interviewed Peter and Susan for a column last May previewing this session, it's funny, I do a lot of interviewing for my column, and sometimes I'm straining to get quotes, and I had the two of them on the telephone. It was like, all I do, and I just can be a transcriptionist. They're so cool, as you're about to hear, they're just brilliant. Anyway, we talked about what they called a Trump amnesia, that the country was seeming not to widely recall or mostly recall January 6th and much of what happened during the Trump presidency. David has known the two of them since they were young journalists at the Post. In my interview, Peter likened his putting final touches on one of David's stories back then as like a med student being allowed to finish the last sutures of a master surgeon. I love that analogy. Please give a warm Madison welcome to Susan Glasser, Peter Baker, and David Maraniss.
Believe me, you wouldn't want me anywhere near a suture. I've been trying to get Susan and Peter here for several years, and they always had a wonderful excuse. Was they were taking their son Theo out to Stanford the very same week as this Idea Fest. But Theo's now bigger than they are, so they don't have to take him anywhere. No, just kidding. But it finally happened, and I'm really delighted. As Paul said, I've known them for a long time. We worked together at the Washington Post and admired everything they've done then and since. And I'm so happy that they agreed to stay over. They're going to have dinner with Chancellor Mnuchin tomorrow night after Liz Cheney. And Peter, it's just a real bonus to have you do that for Liz. And think about it. Liz Cheney, born in Madison, right? And Kamala Harris spent 2 years here, right? A little bit after that. What a confluence. And life works in weird ways, doesn't it? To have those two, and then now Liz Cheney endorsing Kamala Harris. You can never tell. So we have, and then of course Kamala's coming tomorrow as well. Our dream, Paul and my dream, was that she would stop by and do a cameo at the Union. I don't think it's going to happen, but I would love it if it did. But there are no two better people to talk about that and so much other than Peter and Susan. I'm just delighted that you're here. So welcome to Madison.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us. We're delighted to be here, David. Thank you, and thank you, Paul, and the whole team.
So I'm not going to start with this last debate, but with the first one, June 27th, which was actually the day that Linda and I arrived in Madison for the summer. And it didn't get off to a great start. But I sort of describe that as the disaster that might have saved democracy in some. But I'd like to know where you two were that night, whether you were together, what your response was as you were watching it, what you were going to write, what you did write after that evening of June 27th.
Well, first of all, David, thank you so much for having us, and to all of you for sharing your time with us. I have to say, a lot of events we all do. I love the title of this. We are so here for celebrating journalism at a moment when it is more and more embattled than ever, and that includes the student journalists around the country who are increasingly under siege. And so it makes me feel great to see so many people here supporting journalism, independent journalism, with their time and their effort. So thank you for that. Independent journalism, I don't know how it'll survive this story, but the reality of the post-pandemic world is what it is. Peter and I were by ourselves at my mother's summer house in Massachusetts, and I was going to write my column off of it. Peter, I think, wasn't sure. He was going to write something for the next night, and we sort of sat there and we started watching it. And you'll know the one positive aspect of that night was that the news, such as it was, happened very, very quickly. The second that he opened his mouth, really, it was apparent that there was something wrong with Joe Biden, and that he was going to have a very hard time getting through the debate. And, I recall, my reaction to that as a very loud one. Peter probably would second that.
True.
But I want to say that, news kicks in, the adrenaline kicks in, and, we're all sort of old war horses, and, we know when something big is happening. And as a sort of proud wife, I can say, sure, I sat there and I wrote my column, but what I was really watching as this all unfolded in a relatively short period of time is Peter Baker and the news sense kicking in, both at the New York Times and in our living room at my mother's empty house. And, you know, David knows that one of Peter's great strengths is he is just the fastest news writer that there is. And, you know, it's pretty hard to turn out a column for The New Yorker in a short period of time, you know, less than an hour after the end of a debate like that. So, you know, it's not like that is not a tight deadline. But what the real truth is that the New York Times wasn't prepared, I don't think anyone was, for such a catastrophic performance on the part of President Biden. This was a moment when it was a sort of, you know, big fat naked emperor in the room moment. You know, you couldn't unsee what was happening. It was very clear this was going to have enormous political ramifications outside the normal thing. Peter starts texting, people reacting. The New York Times had no plan for this, so of course the plan is Peter. And he actually filed a story that was leading the New York Times website before the debate was even over, and it was a reported story about Democrats at senior levels panicking about Biden's performance. And, you know, I watched that while still somehow trying to bat out my column, and I was amazed.
Peter's so modest, but you don't even want to talk about it, but it's, but tell me about your feelings that night.
I mean, let's be honest. It was not exactly. It was dog bites man. Everybody understood what the news was. It wasn't hard to interpret. And actually, don't let Susan fool you. What she does every week is remarkable because, and we're going to do this little back and forth, and then we'll disagree with each other if it'll make you feel better. But she every week through this column, she writes for the New Yorker. And the New Yorker's had a tradition of this going back decades, but so very few people can find a way to encapsulate the nutty absurdity, but serious consequences of what's going on in Washington, all bringing it together in a cohesive way, the way she does. Now, she gets to write stronger headlines like the one you heard about than I get to write, but we are lucky to get to work together. People often ask, how do you work as journalists together? We work correspondence together. We've written some books together. And the answer is we met in the Post newsroom in 1998. She was my editor. And
not technically.
Yes, she assigned me stories. She edited my stories. But anyway, so we've been working together.
I did not set his salary. I had no role in his review.
That's the lawyer's answer.
I was there. Yeah. There are a lot of office romances, actually, but this is probably the most productive. So, you know, it's sort of a human tendency to forget what you don't want to remember. And after that, I think that my feeling was that a lot of the reason that Joe Biden was still in the race or running for re-election when at one point he'd said he wasn't going to is because of perhaps his uncertainty, but certainly the uncertainty of the Washington, I don't know what you want to call it, the pundits, the elite, whatever, questions about Kamala. And I include myself in the idea that maybe everybody underestimated her. Did you see this coming? The way she has developed over the last 3 months?
Well, I mean, just to the point about Biden, I do think that this is a really interesting example where sort of the inside Washington consensus was actually really lagging unusually behind the rest of the country. And, for more than 2 years, you had one thing that Americans very strongly agreed upon, something like 75 to 80% of Americans in most of the public polls said that Joe Biden is too old to be president. And again, for another term, not speaking about this term. And this was a remarkably consistent survey finding. Even, it wasn't the debate that caused people to think this. They had already concluded this. And yet, in the world in which we operated, and I would say that I would fix it a little bit more directly on Biden and his team and the White House, and then, the sort of party infrastructure writ large that took its cue from him. I think that they very aggressively even promoted the idea that Harris was not up to the job of defeating Donald Trump, and that became the justification for doing something that, really wasn't examined in a way that benefited the country and ultimately that benefited Joe Biden. When you had a situation, speaking of a sort of, naked emperor in the room, not that he's not capable of doing the job right now or anything like that, but what I mean is that he was asking the country to reelect him to be 86 years old. And I think that it didn't receive the full airing that you might have imagined such a decision would receive. And it was a pretty painful time, I would say, really, for the 2 years preceding what happened in June and the decision to pull out. But what I saw was that, frankly, the White House did Kamala Harris a terrible disservice. And I thought it was really notable that you actually had Ron Klain, who was Joe Biden's first chief of staff, in an on-the-record quote in a story somewhere, saying we did her a disservice. I think that's a fair statement. And obviously, none of us really expected this summer of campaign joy that sort of materialized in the wake.
Peter, you were covering the White House, the Biden White House, during that whole 4 years. Did you see them sort of misusing her or misrepresenting her? Or?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. She had a bad first 3 years as vice president, and some of that's on her. And there's no question that the Biden team around him didn't necessarily help her. That's certainly what Ron Klain is saying now anyway, and I think others might say that after the election when there's less consequence. They didn't really help her a lot. So there are a couple of things going on. One is it's important to remember the history of the vice presidency, right? If you go back to 1976, think about this. Go back to 1976 with one exception. Every vice president had more experience in Washington than the president that they served, right? So they served as kind of an ambassador to Washington for a new president. They helped him understand things. Biden for Obama, Cheney for Bush, Gore for Clinton, Mondale for Carter, and so on and so forth. They had something of value to offer the president. What did Kamala Harris have to offer when it comes to that to Joe Biden? He didn't think anybody needed to tell him anything about Congress. He'd been there for, 36 years as a senator, 8 years as vice president. He didn't think anybody needed to tell him anything about foreign affairs. He had done that, met everybody. So she didn't have the advantage that he had as vice president for Barack Obama of having an obvious role to play. And without that role, then they gave her some pretty crappy assignments, like go fix the border. It wasn't quite as simple as that, they'll tell you, but that's basically what they were saying. Not a great assignment, obviously. Fix voting rights, didn't go anywhere. And she had a hard time impressing people, right? And what you heard in Washington, I'm not talking about Republicans, but among Democrats, were thoroughly unimpressed with her. They said, she's really not stepping up. She can't do anything to define herself. We got to figure out how to get rid of her. Susan and I were at a dinner party 2 years ago, maybe, something like that. A very senior Democrat who actually helped her get on the ticket in the first place said, our biggest problem is how to get rid of Kamala Harris, right? That was the attitude among Democrats. Now, some of that is Joe Biden, right? It's very in his interest, of course, to say, I'm the only guy who can beat Trump. She can't, Gretchen can't, Gavin can't. I'm the only guy who can beat Trump, and therefore encourages him to do what many people might have thought they should have had a conversation about earlier than June. Since then, though, she has clearly shown that she has risen to the occasion, right? And it may be that she becomes president and wins, and it may be that we see the weaknesses again. But for right now, anyway, she's had a pretty flawless start to this campaign. It's hard to find any major mistakes that she's made. We wish she'd give more interviews. We wish, she would talk to the reporters more. But broadly speaking, she has had a pretty good, effective start, and it makes people think they underestimated her.
There's always that urge for candidates to talk more to the press. And, one of the, historically, if you talk to the press, they become suckers for you. I mean, that was John McCain's trick, right? But it's also true that the press asks a lot of stupid questions, and they're looking to get you, and that's, so a majority of the questions that are asked of Kamala are of that nature, or that's what people want. So, it's kind of a complicated issue, but I think you're right. But then you get to the second debate, I presume you weren't at your vacation house that time. Where were you, and how did you respond that time?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Peter had to actually go and, or you were in New York. You were by yourself, though. I was going to say you were in a newsroom, but really newsrooms, sadly, are pretty dead these days. No, I was watching it in Washington with my son and my brother, who's also a journalist, which is good. And actually, it's interesting. I had a much more clear reaction early on to them. I think that, there's a little bit of trauma in the country, with the sort of this sense of it's such a divided country. Everybody's going to weaponize everything. This goes to your point about the interviews. And it was interesting. To me, it seemed very clear-cut that, Harris was dominating, that we live in an age where these debates are cut up, they're sliced and diced, and part of the goal is to have, quick sound bites or things that are going to be recycled on social media, on TikTok. So, as soon as Donald Trump said, they're eating the dogs. I felt fairly confident in my judgment that no matter what else, this would go down in the history of debates, right? Debates, you don't remember the whole 90 minutes or 2 hours of a debate. You remember in 2020, Joe Biden, getting fed up with Donald Trump and saying, will you just shut up, man? That's what you remember. People remember Jerry Ford, and stumbling over the question of Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. So for me, I guess for us, it tells you something about our era, that instead of Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, we're now going to be remembering the fake eating the dogs story. By the way, I am totally signed up for all those memes and internet videos. But I thought it was pretty clear cut. But it was interesting to me to watch, two observers who didn't have to write, a column about it, say like, oh, I don't know, will anyone give her the benefit of the doubt, or, Trump's fans are just going to be Trump's fans. And I think that also does reflect a reality that we live in. Even a made-up story that's meant to promote something hurtful, that's lying about a community on purpose. Even that, there are millions of people in this country who believe that, just as there are millions of people in this country who believe that the election was stolen. In my view, the stories about Springfield are very similar to Donald Trump saying that Kamala Harris, I heard she's not even really black. Why is he doing that? It's not complicated, unfortunately, I don't think. I think he wants us to talk about Kamala Harris's race. He's an old-fashioned race baiter.
I agree with that. I would guess that probably 98% of the people in this audience were nervous that day of the debate. Am I right? What's gonna happen? So it wasn't just the eating the dogs and cats and pets, and our grandchildren were shocked by that story about the operations on transgender aliens. What are aliens? But anyway, it was also Kamala rising to that occasion as well, right, Peter? I mean,
no, they had a study of how to debate Donald Trump, and the theory of the case was how to get under his skin, right? And by the way, it was the same theory of the case for Biden in June. He couldn't execute their strategy. He couldn't execute their strategy. Their strategy was to needle him on things that they knew would get a rise. To me, the dog thing obviously is going to be the social media meme, and Susan's right, for years that's what people remember. But in some ways, the most telling moment was when they're talking about immigration, which is a tough issue for the Democrats, a weakness, a vulnerability for Kamala Harris. And she managed to change the subject by talking about his crowd size at his rallies, right? And getting under his skin. They're leaving, they're so bored that they're leaving your rallies. He has this great issue for him to talk about. And instead of talking about immigration, he's taking the bait. And he's talking about his crowd sizes. And they clearly had studied him enough to know how to do that. So turn your opponent's weaknesses against him, and that's what she did on that debate stage. Having said that, as Susan said, it is fascinating. All the pundits, or at least a lot of the pundits, including a lot of conservative pundits, say she won. 2/3 in the poll I saw recently said she won, and it made not one whit of difference on the horse race, bottom line. People have made up their minds. And the very few people who haven't, who may decide this, I don't know what they're waiting for, but they basically, most of the country is pretty locked in at this point and not really open to new information.
I think that it was not just Kamala baiting him on that, but I think it probably goes back to Obama at the convention. You know, he's baited Trump several times, sometimes to his regret probably, but in parallel with the strong showing of Kamala at that debate and so on, I'm curious whether you agree or disagree with me on this. I think something else is going on, which is that everybody knew that Trump would run an ugly campaign. Springfield's part of it. The immigration everything's part of it. Distortion and lies, basically. But it seems to me that it's having less effect this year. That partly it's people have seen the show too many times, but partly it's that the Democrats have learned how to deal with it in a different way, and Kamala is shown that through her campaign of joy or whatever. But it seems to me that the country is shifting a little bit away from buying all of that from Trump.
Yeah, I mean, we'll know soon enough, what the outcome is. But I do think that there's a different approach. And one thing you see, maybe some of it is because she's more able to execute a playbook, and she has a broader set of moves available to her. But I think that laughing at Donald Trump. Deflating a bully, has long been sort of a recommended course of action, but it's been hard. And I think that, you're starting to see, we don't know Kamala Harris as well as a politician as we know Joe Biden. And I think we're starting to understand how she's different from Biden in terms of responding to this. It's not that she disagrees with any of the statements that Biden has made, but, I think that 4 years into it is a little hard to sustain, the constant sense of, justifiable moral outrage, right? Joe Biden told the same origin story over and over again about, I watched Charlottesville, and that's not who we are, people. We're not, there's only one America. We've all heard it from Biden. It's very powerful stuff, but it's different when you hear Kamala Harris's version of it. And I do think that she's done two things quite effectively that Biden didn't do, which is to use humor against Trump, and also now she can turn Trump's age and sort of disconnection from reality to her advantage. That was not a play that was available to Joe Biden, the oldest president in American history. But every single time that Harris appears, and I'm sure tomorrow here in Madison she'll say the same thing. She'll say, it's the same old tired playbook. She'll dismiss the lies without engaging too much in them. And I agree with you that it's an effective technique for her that enables her to look like she's owning him. There was a poll finding today that we all know how much Donald Trump loves to use words like strong and tough, and everything is, I very strongly objected, I'm very tough. And there was a survey, the latest survey from the AP after the debate, it had a slightly higher percentage of Americans saying that Kamala Harris was tough enough to be president than saying that Donald Trump was. And I just thought, well, now that's getting inside his head.
You have anything to add to that, Peter?
No, she got it.
Yeah. See, this is the week of strong women, right? So Nancy Pelosi, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Liz Cheney, Heather Cox Richardson, Judy Collins. So I'm sort of thinking of Peter over there as kind of the Doug Emhoff of this. But I'd like to sort of, not psychoanalyze, but get into, everybody says, how could this possibly be? How could half of the country buy this, right? So this might be a little unfair, but, Susan and Peter spent years in Russia, Soviet Union. And I'm curious, dealing with an autocrat, right? And I'm curious, sort of how you saw that nation. Of course, it never really had a democracy, so it's different in that sense. But what you saw about the people of Russia and how they were, how they dealt with an autocrat, and whether you see any parallels between the attraction of Putin to Americans' attraction to Trump.
That's a really interesting question, a provocative question. I would say there are some things that are very similar and some things that aren't, right? There's no question that, and Susan wrote a piece actually at the beginning of Trump's presidency, I think in the New York Times, right, about sort of how we recognized some of the playbook that Trump was using from our time in Russia. We were there at the beginning of Putin's tenure, right? And the attacks on a free press, use of phrases like enemies of the people, the dominance of personality more than ideology as a idée fixe for his party, in effect taking over an existing political party and making it wholly owned subsidiary. So there are these similarities. The differences, of course, are that in Russia, as you say, there never really had been a democracy, and they went through the 90s when they were told what they had was a democracy, and what they saw was chaos. They lost their life savings. They saw corrupt people taking over major businesses, becoming billionaires and oligarchs. They saw organized crime was just rampant. They saw chaotic politics, and they said, if that's democracy, we don't want it, right? And so Putin came along and said, fine, the social compact will be, you give me power, I will take care of that. And Russians were more, through their history, had more of a history of accepting that kind of leadership, or at least being accustomed to it. It's different here, obviously. I would say that the appeal of Trump is different, and it's something important for us to understand, or at least study, or at least ask about, because it is 46, 47% of the country, however you look at it. Now, I think a lot of Republicans are not happy with Trump and are still going to vote for him. That's one segment of the party. Then there are the ones who actually genuinely find him appealing and are really drawn to him. And there is obviously a magnetism there that works with that base. They don't care that the elite media sits there and nitpicks and fact checks. They think that he's the only honest person. What's really fascinating is this very big dichotomy among views. People in the media, and obviously Democrats, would say he is, not a truth teller. Your newspaper, the Washington Post, our former newspaper, cataloged more than 30,000 things that he said while he was president that were false or misleading. Think about that, 30,000. He just today said about the debate with Kamala Harris, he says, the audience was up in an uproar. There was no audience.
That was great.
Right? So he lives in this different reality sometimes, and we sit there and say, there was no audience. And I think for his people, they're like, you guys are just, you're just out to get him. He tells a larger truth, and he is the most honest person from their point of view that they see in politics, because he doesn't play the politically correct game. He doesn't play the skirting around the edges game. He tells them exactly what he thinks. Immigrants are bad. Communists. These guys are communists, and they find that strength, that appeal, intoxicating at times. I've been to his rallies, and it's very strong. And the last thing I'll say is remarkable how specific it is to him. It's not about MAGA, and it's not about other MAGA figures. It is about him. All these people who introduce him, all these other Republican figures, people who fashion themselves after him to some extent. Ted Cruz, Lindsey Graham, Josh Hawley, name them. Mike Pence at the time was vice president. Get up and they introduce him, and the crowd's like, whatever. Okay. When Trump gets up there, like
J.D. Vance too.
J.D. Vance too. Absolutely right. None of these people had the same. Ron DeSantis. See what happened to him. None of these people have the connection with that crowd that he has. It is something very specific to him, and we have to try to understand that because it's fascinating and it's important.
Have you studied that, Susan?
Well, I do think it's a really important question, because this is, the U.S. Is not a total outlier here. I just actually did a book event yesterday with some colleagues in Washington. It's an academic book, but it's a really interesting book that's coming out, and it's called The Origins of Elected Strongmen. And it is an international comparative political science book that attempts to, in part to kind of break down and answer your question here. Russia is one of, is almost the template for why we've had 17 straight years of a rollback of democracy, according to Freedom House, right? And, Peter and I happen to go from the Washington of the Clinton era to Putin in the first 4 years. So we watched essentially the rollback of what that fragile democracy was, which is what Peter alluded to. There's a certain playbook, taking on not only the independent media, that is definitely the first step in all of these aspiring authoritarians, but doing things to systematically weaken and undermine any potential rival power centers. That includes, taking over the legislature, the Duma in Russia, changing the rules of eligibility, doing things to, look at essentially what we consider technicalities in election law, for example, and going after that. There were so many commonalities, and I thought it was really interesting in this conversation about this book that, we spent a lot of time talking about the appeal of populism in the United States and other Western democracies over the last decade or so. But the term that they're using is personalism, and to talk about the appeal of personalist leaders and personalist parties. And I do think that an underappreciated fact about what's driving this in the United States over these last 9 years already was the hollowing out of the Republican Party and of our party system in general that enabled Donald Trump essentially to come in as an outsider, right? He was a party switcher. He'd been, according in the book, The Divider, we looked at this, I think it was 5 different party affiliations at different times in his life, right? So he's an outsider, and his son-in-law once in an interview with Peter referred to it as a quote, hostile takeover of the Republican Party. And I think without the weakness of that party and his ability to take it over and turn it into, to transform it from a party of ideas, as you know, many of his core notions are very, very different than what just 10 years ago we would have thought of as basic core principles of the Republican Party. And it shows you in many ways how we overstate the role of ideology, in our elections, but it also shows you how open this party was to the appeal of a wannabe strongman. The final point, though, that I think is a really important point. Sure, it's a 50-50 country, more or less, but I think Peter's point is often overlooked. The full core MAGA base is not 50% of the country. It's not the totality of the Republican Party. That is the MAGA Donald Trump movement. It's a minoritarian movement that has the possibility to take control over the whole country. And there's a long history, not just in our country, of that happening.
Well, Hitler was a minority party.
Well, that's right.
And so you're seeing a commonality between that personal, what do you call it, personalism?
Yeah.
Putin, Orban, all of the other strongmen around the world are sort of hollowing out something to take.
Yeah, well, I mean, to your point, right? Like, how is it possible that this is happening in America? Imagine being, a sort of a liberal young Muscovite or, at St. Petersburg 2 years ago. There was no groundswell of outpouring of desire for Russia to invade its neighbor, to be bombing schools and hospitals and kindergartens in Ukraine. Russians, like Ukrainians, grew up on a diet of sort of, gauzy patriotism that were brothers, basically. And how was it possible that this could happen? And that basically 1 million Russians left the country rather than participate in the war, and everybody else has just been going along with it. And I think that, we're lucky, thank goodness, that we have a different history, as Peter said. We have different traditions, and we're not, engaged in a terrible war of destruction of Mexico or Canada. But it's not a dissimilar psychological phenomenon.
I would add just one last thing on this. This is happening in America at a time when faith in our institutions has just eroded drastically, right? I don't have the numbers in front of me. I wish I did. But all the polls show that our faith in not just the media, obviously, but in Congress, in the courts, in local government, state government, in business, everything except for basically the military, I think.
Airline pilots.
Airline pilots, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Has gone down drastically, right? And the question that pollsters like to ask, do you think the country is heading in the right track or wrong track? The wrong track number has been, or the right track number has been under 50%. In other words, a majority of the country has thought we were on the wrong track for 20 years, since the second Bush term. I don't think there's been a single result in the Gallup poll above 50%. So we are in a sour mood as a country. And
I think it's always that, though, don't you? I mean, I remember Haynes Johnson and Broder going out 40, 45 years ago writing that same story about the country being...
But that's how much more the numbers have crashed since then, right? They took much higher numbers and found them disturbing, and they were disturbing then.
That's a good point.
And they've kind of like crashed through the floor even more so. And I think that's an atmosphere in which a guy like Trump comes along and says, I'll break up the system. The system isn't working for you. The system is broken. So what do you care? He said it the other day. What the hell do you have to lose? That was the phrase he used in 16. He used it the other night. And that's his pitch.
Let me go to the press for a little bit, and we'll go back to it later, too. But I sort of describe Peter, working for the New York Times, being their key political writer, having to walk a tightrope. Because there are certain expectations of what a reporter can say and should say and what his job is, whereas Susan, writing for The New Yorker, has more freedom. But these 9 years of Trump have challenged the press in ways that nothing else has before. And I'm curious, Peter, about sort of from the inside looking at how the Times has reacted to that. First, how long it took for them to call lies lies, for you to have a little more ability to write the... I mean, we're always trying to write the truth, but sometimes fair and balanced isn't the truth, right? And that's sort of pounded into reporters, too, in a way. How long it took to get to saying lies. And now, in the last month or two, the cliche of the moment is sane washing, right? Which is, it's a valid point. How do you that means taking something crazy that Trump said, and how do you convey that, or rather than sort of paraphrase him and make sense out of it? It's probably a little easier for Susan to do that than you. I don't know, but take me through the Times and how that's evolved over these 9 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. It is a challenge of journalism. And I think that there is a desire on the part of some of our readers and our voters that we become more vocal in what we say and that we do things in a different way. And I understand that impulse. And I think that we need to find a way to address the challenge of this time without losing our fundamental values. And the fundamental values are... I've given it the word objective because I think objective is too possible a word. But independence. Independence is a better word. Our job is to be independent and fact-driven. And so, yes, we want to hold Trump and, for that matter, Biden and anybody else accountable. That doesn't mean it's equal. And it shouldn't be a false equivalence. And we shouldn't say that because Trump has been convicted of 34 felonies, Biden is also a bad guy. It doesn't work that way. We should not shy away from saying Trump has said this and done this, and these are different than what other politicians, including other Republicans, have done or would say. So I think we're more willing to you're right, to be stronger in our language, but I think we also want to avoid going too far in which we lose our principles. We lose what makes journalism different and special, because if we do that, what he wants us to be is the opposition, right? He wants us to be the opposition. And ironically, so do some of his critics. They also want us to be the opposition. If we do that, we've lost who we are, okay? And I think then we lose the ability to communicate to voters and readers who may not share Trump's critics' points of view, but ought to be open to fact-based reporting and analysis. And I think it's so important that we not, be perceived as taking sides, but that doesn't mean that we don't write tough stories. Most of the tough things you ever heard about Donald Trump were reported in the New York Times or the Washington Post first, right?
Absolutely,
let's face it.
True.
We don't say it in a shrill way. We try not to say it in an oppositional way, but the facts are dug up by our reporters. I'll come back to the lie point, and that's just, and I'll wrap up. The lie question is a hard one. We don't like to use the L word, as we say, because a couple of reasons. One is it comes across as a little shrill. If you say he's lying, he's lying, he's lying, if you do it every day, you start to lose the power of it for one thing, and you lose readers probably as well, because they start thinking, well, you just don't like him. It's just about you and not about the facts. And it also implies that you know it's in somebody's head, right? If I say that John politician is lying, it implies that I know that he knows what he or she or whoever is saying is not true. In some cases, you can say that, right? And our editor, Dean Baquet, who was the editor during most of Trump, through all of Trump, I think, he was very judicious about when we used it, didn't want to overdo it, but he would use it from time to time. And he said we would use it in times when it's so obvious that something Trump is saying he's been corrected repeatedly, he knows it's not true because it's been told it's not true, and therefore we will say it. For instance, the idea that the election was stolen in 2020, we call that a lie. When he said the birther lie, we call that a lie. So, again, we don't do it every day. We don't do it everything he says is not true, but we do it when we think it's appropriate. We try to be judicious, but we try to also be, fulfill our responsibility of accountability reporting.
When Marty Barron, who was then the Post editor, came here at our first Idea Fest, he said, and this was 2017, right, when Trump was taking office, and Trump was calling us the enemy of the people, Marty said, we're not at war, we're at work. And I think that's the philosophy that...
I love that. I thought that's always the best way to look at it.
And to your other point, I know that it's interesting that a lot of the criticism of the Post and the New York Times, I don't know about the New Yorker, but is coming from the left. Yes. And, it's easy to watch MSNBC at night and hear one of their people sort of complain about the mainstream press when all of their stories are coming from the Washington Post and the New York Times. That's just a fact of life. Yeah.
Well, and I think, look, it is worth also mentioning, and we should make Susan answer this question so I get off the hot seat, but it is worth mentioning that every president hates us. Every president doesn't like reporters. Every president I've covered anyway was mad at us at some point or other. Bill Clinton was not happy with a lot of our reporting.
No kidding.
Yeah, right? And he made it clear, right?
Yes.
Same with Bush and Obama and Biden. But there's a fundamental difference between that and enemies of the people.
Yep.
And fake news. And what Trump has been trying to do has been to undermine the very idea of a free press, okay? That's a different thing. It's okay that we're adversarial with presidents. We should be. That's our job. But we should not be, we're not enemies. And when Trump does that, he's doing it to prevent any contrary information. He told Leslie Stahl this once. Unfortunately, it was off camera. She asked him, why do you always attack the media so much? He said to her, it's in order to discredit you, so that when you write things about me I don't like, people won't believe you. And so we need to be careful not to fall into the trap of being discredited either by him or discrediting ourselves.
And boy, has he done that over the years. Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Susan? Or?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you're exactly right to point out that this is not a phenomenon that's limited to one side of our political spectrum. In many ways, you could argue that the question of Biden's suitability to be president again for another 4 years is also a very strong argument for an independent press. Certainly, the pushback on the left has been really striking in the last few years as the threat from Trump has turned everything into an existential crisis in our democracy. You've seen absolutely the rise of a kind of intolerance, of disbelieving facts that are inconvenient for the narrative. There was a lot of people who, if you wrote in February, March of this year that, that Joe Biden might have a hard time winning re-election because he was so old, you would get an incredible pushback. Even after his debate performance, ask any journalist practically who was doing their job of independent reporting what kind of pushback they were getting from people, from supporters of the Democrats online. It's a very intolerant time. It is a moment when journalism is increasingly viewed through a partisan lens of a country that has become so much more polarized and so much more partisan. And, I think that is really important. But, the threat from Trump is something that is of a different magnitude. And one of the most important columns I think I wrote early on in my time at the New Yorker was a piece about what is the origin of the phrase enemies of the people. What is the origin of Donald Trump calling his opponents human scum? That is the language of tyranny. It's the language of tyrants. When we lived in the former Soviet Union, you asked us about this, the actual phrase by which people were condemned in the legal code, in Stalin's repressions, they were condemned as vrag naroda, enemy of the people. That was the formal phrase in the legal code. And, Donald Trump, obviously not very historically literate, told again and again and again, he was, of course, told that this was not language appropriate for the president of the United States. And, I think that, in a way, the whole challenge for us as journalists in the last 9 years is how do you maintain that healthy sense of this is something really extraordinary. This is actually shocking, even if it is no longer surprising. And doing that in a way that doesn't lose your audience, that doesn't lose your ability to be dispassionate, to be independent, to be a critical thinker. This is really, I think, part of the overall crisis for all of us. I don't think it's limited to journalism, this issue.
Can I read one thing? I love this quote. Somebody once wrote about his journalist father. He wrote, "He taught me to be skeptical but not cynical, to root for underdogs, think for myself, be wary of rigid ideologies, and search for the messy truth wherever it took me." And I think that is as good a definition of journalism as I've ever heard. And
That was my father, Elliot Maraniss. Of course, Trump doesn't know anything about Stalin, and you can bet $1 million he's never heard of Ibsen and The Enemy of the People, and that the fact that the enemy of the people was the one honest person in that story. So you two wrote a 700-page book, The Divider.
oh, no, it's much shorter. Don't count the footnotes.
Oh, sorry. Oh, you're right.
It's a quick read.
You're right. No, and it's true. Whenever you look at a book, it's not how long it is; it's how well it's written. If you read a great story in the New Yorker, I'm always counting the pages to see how much more I get to read, not because I want to. And that's the way this book is. But in any case, my question, and it's sort of lighthearted, but not exactly. When you spend that many years and that much time on Donald Trump, do you come out of it with PTSD?
Look, first of all, I would say that, there is the recurring nightmare aspect of this, because every time I say 9 years into this, I have to check myself because I can't believe that we're 9 years into this. But, I might have a slightly different perspective on this than Peter, but for me, the chance to write The Divider, to go back and debrief. We were able to interview about 300 officials, most of them, by the way, Republican appointees of Donald Trump or nonpartisan, independent national security officials. And for me, the chance that actually, rather than being sort of PTSD, it was actually an opportunity to have a little bit of agency and to get a little bit of agency back. It was our chance, to try to wrestle with what this 4 years was, what had just happened. It was also our opportunity to, document a crime scene. That's what we call it in the book. And, for me in general, David knows I spent a lot of my career as an editor. I love being an editor. It's a great way to have a lot of ideas that you don't have to execute them all yourself. But the truth is, I made a very clear, sort of choice or had a clear theory of the case at the beginning of the Trump era in 2017. And, in some ways, if I had my druthers, I'd still be the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, or focusing on Russia or a lot of the things that are happening in the world today. But I remember I had a conversation literally in January of 2017 with Strobe Talbot, who was at the time the head of the Brookings Institution. He had been the Deputy Secretary of State. He was
Under
kind
Clinton,
of Bill Clinton's Russia whisperer for the era after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And, Strobe said, listen, I just had the Japanese National Security Advisor sitting right here where you're sitting. And I said, well, what brings you to town? And the guy said to Strobe, well, I'm here because this is the epicenter of global instability, right here in Washington, D.C. And, for me, I think, ever since then, I had a really clear sense, like, if you want to understand, like, this is the story of our time. There isn't a bigger foreign policy issue than, frankly, how Wisconsin is going to vote, in not even 50 days from now. And so I've really tried to keep that in mind through all of this. And I do think that when we did the book, that was part of what informed my wanting to do the book, and seeing it as really almost an opportunity that was an important one.
Yeah, I had PTSD.
Or you were deeply there more often than Susan.
No, she's right. I mean, she's absolutely right. We want to bear witness.
Yeah,
It's important. We did think the book was a work of history. We didn't think it was going to be prologue. And that's one thing that made it a little different. In fact, the title on the cover says The Divider, Trump in the White House originally. And then if you look at their dates on there, 2017 to 2021, we didn't put that on there. The publisher wanted to put those on there. And we said, you're just going to be trolling the readers here. You're just really going to be like baiting them. But the publisher wanted to make clear the book was about those 4 years, specifically, not a biography. But we found time and time again, there was so much. We thought we knew so much about what happened. The reporting showed how much we didn't know, how much more there was to know. That the chairman of the Joint Chiefs wrote a secret letter of resignation they didn't send to Trump, but it just eviscerated Trump, in his words, as basically somebody who didn't even believe in the values that America fought World War II for. That Trump told John Kelly, his own chief of staff, that he wanted his generals to be like Hitler's generals. That when Trump got mad at a ruling by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, he ordered his aides to find a way to eliminate the court, which they obviously didn't do. That, time and time again, things we thought we understood, there was so much more to the story than we knew. And so that's always the value of doing any book, and I think particularly one like this about a pretty consequential time.
Well, it's a very valuable book. And as an aside, I think there's a difference there between that book and writing a biography of Donald Trump, which I could never do because I find him boring, essentially one superficial, not really that interesting, whereas his presidency had all of these other elements to it that are so absorbing, and the deeper you got into it, the book is incredible for those of you who haven't read it. And I think it's especially haunting for all of you to read it now, and thinking about how scary it would be if he came back into office. Because as Peter was saying, the way that he, without those generals really standing up to him, who knows what would have happened. And they're not going to be there this next time.
Yeah, I think you're right, David, that was one of our big takeaways from doing all the reporting for the book and sitting there and trying to really evaluate what had just happened. This sense that, a lot of people took heart or comfort, I should say, from the idea that, well, the system held, or, the worst case scenario didn't unfold. You hear that a lot from Republicans right now who maybe don't like Donald Trump very much, but they still see themselves as partisan Republicans, and often you'll hear that from them. That was not the conclusion that we took from this book, and we were a little bit open-minded on this question, but I think for us, the reporting underscored the fragility of the institutions, the fact that we were one vice president away, one chairman of the Joint Chiefs, one attorney general, one acting attorney general, which is a pretty, not the most powerful role to be in, to defy a president of the United States, to be an unconfirmed acting attorney general in the final weeks of a presidency, and to stand up to a president in the way that occurred in early January of 2021, that we were way too dependent on the unknown and unknowable actions of a small handful of individuals. And that, to me, if this was, a stress test of our democracy, what it showed was extraordinary weaknesses. And so I have actually taken away a very different point of view than a lot of people, which is to say, it confirmed for me that American democracy is on much less stable footing than we would have assumed it to be. And first of all, second of all, it actually kind of made me reevaluate my views about, should one serve in a Trump administration. In many ways, the book is kind of a story of Trump and the Republican enablers. The infrastructure around him, the people that Trump himself is not very interesting. I kind of buy, that your point of view on that, and that what's really interesting is to watch what happens when other people are forced with inevitable, terrible moral choices and compromises that Donald Trump seems to sort of impose on all those who come near him. And, so for me, there's a really interesting question. You wouldn't want to be Mark Esper, but you probably would really prefer that Mark Esper was going to be the Secretary of Defense than any of the people who are going to be selected for it this time.
So were you saying that you said that you sort of changed your view on whether you should serve in that administration or not? What's the answer then?
Well, again, don't say you as in me personally.
No, I know.
I definitely wouldn't be.
One.
I don't think that answer's changed.
No, that answer's pretty consistent.
Yeah, right.
No, look, what a terrible dilemma. What a terrible dilemma. But I do think that, Trump is highly dependent on the staff and those who are surrounding him, especially were he to come back into the presidency, both because, he neither knows nor cares about the vast majority of things that an administration does. So, it is a truism of any large bureaucracy that, the cadres are everything, but it's particularly true of Donald Trump that who he is surrounded by will matter. It's also true that conflict is endemic to how Trump runs things, so he's very likely to have advisors pitted against each other and disagreeing. But I think that, it does matter who's in those jobs, and the outcome from Rick Grinnell being Secretary of State, versus someone else being Secretary of State, there's a significant variation one could imagine.
Yeah, I would just add that when we, and David, you may have had these conversations too. I remember all these dinners and lunches with Republican friends or Republican sources in early 2017, in which they were debating among themselves this question that Susan's talking about. And a lot of them said, understandably, I could never work for that man. It would be a repugnant thing to do it. He doesn't stand for anything I believe in, da-da-da-da. And a lot of them were saying, yeah, okay, I see that. But, I think some of them, anyway, had believed out of a sense of patriotism or a belief that they could help make things better, decided to go work for him. And I think a lot of them who did that ended up paying a price. They got, eviscerated in some way or another. They got fired, in some cases investigated, and discovered that their ability to influence was limited in any case. But he's not going to have those people, as Susan just said. We had this quote in the book from a national security official who was in the Oval Office with him an awful lot during his first and possibly only term, we'll see. And this national security advisor said that he compared him to the velociraptor in Jurassic Park. You remember the dinosaur movie, Jurassic Park, the original? And in the original movie, the kids are running from the velociraptor who's chasing them into the industrial kitchen, and they slam the industrial kitchen door closed and think, okay, thank God, he can't get through there, except that the velociraptor then has learned how to turn the handle and to open the door. The velociraptor has learned. And this national security official is saying that is Trump. Doesn't mean that Trump has learned about healthcare policy. He probably doesn't know any more today than he did 5 years ago. He's got concepts of a plan.
Concepts of a plan.
But what he has learned is how government works and how power works in Washington. Remember, he never had any experience in government. The only president in our history without a single day in government or the military before he took over didn't understand how it worked. Now he understands at least a lot better. And one of the things he's come to the conclusion of is you don't surround yourself with the people like John Kelly and Jim Mattis, they're not going to be in their second administration.
Which gets to the whole issue of the executive branch writ large in this next administration. And the concept of a plan is 2025, right? And what is that going to look like if it happens?
Yeah, by the way, for all the disavowals of it, that's the plan.
Exactly.
I would not be under any illusions there. There's, the calculations of those supporting Trump, I think, are very instructive to look at. For many different constituencies, they've seen Trump's transactionalism, and they've made the view that it's a good deal for them. Look at how Trump has had extraordinary support, the highest levels of support from white evangelical Christians in the country. Well, their number one issue was abortion and the Supreme Court. Donald Trump gave them a Supreme Court that tossed out Roe versus Wade. From their point of view, was that transaction worth it? My guess is that they would say yes, it was worth it. I think there's a lot of constituencies, certainly industries, businesses that want to get regulations thrown out or that want to have extraordinary influence over those agencies in a second Trump term. Donald Trump is probably going to be pretty content to allow them to do so. When Elon Musk says he wants to be in charge of a commission to look at government regulation, Donald Trump says, great, absolutely, sign me up. And so I think that partially it's the transactional nature of who Donald Trump is. There are very few core issues, for him, first of all. Secondly, institutional Washington, the Republican side, has figured out how to work with him. Okay, well, he's disorganized. He's never going to have, a kind of a disciplined cadre, but we can do that and impose our agenda upon the Trump administration. And I think that's a dynamic that we would see a lot, is the push-pull there of people who have figured out how to work the Trump system. The Republicans, and not just Trump himself in this kind of analogy, are the velociraptors.
Peter, would you have to cover a second Trump administration?
I don't have any plans to change jobs anytime soon, so I have nothing for you on that. I have nothing to announce today. But look, if he's president, that's what I do. I cover presidents.
Yeah. You also wrote a very insightful book on a Republican, James Baker, and last night the first interview was with Tommy Thompson, who was, a very jovial guy and sort of has an image of being a moderate Republican. And yet he said he's supporting Trump, even though he obviously can't stand the guy. I can only imagine that James Baker, sort of the epitome of traditional republicanism in its most responsible fashion in some ways, must also despise Trump, and yet 94 years old, and where is he today?
Well, it's really interesting. So when we wrote this biography of Baker, in part because he was really someone who offered us the chance to tell the story of the Republican Party from the end of the Watergate era to the end of the Cold War, right? He's a mixture of politics. He ran 5 national campaigns, and he was also Secretary of the Treasury, White House Chief of Staff, and Secretary of State. In today's age, it's inconceivable that anyone would have those mix of jobs. Imagine Karl Rove having also been George W. Bush's Secretary of State, right? Like, it's inconceivable. Baker, as you said, is a man of the establishment, and it happened that when we were working on this biography was the period of Trump's rise to power in the Republican Party. And you're exactly right that, Baker was appalled. He was shocked. We would talk about it in all of our interviews. He said, he's crazy. He's nuts. this isn't my kind of Republican Party. We're the party of free trade. What is he doing? He's saying insane things. He was offended by the lies in particular. I remember we would talk with him a lot, like in, the 2016 campaign. And, he said, like, Mexico isn't going to pay for that wall. Why does he keep saying that? And he was really offended at the idea that you would lie to the public. This is the guy who was George H.W. Bush's best friend, from the tennis courts of the Houston Country Club. It was wrong. You shouldn't lie like that. Obviously, Mexico's not going to pay for the wall. And yet, I sat down with Baker just days before the 2016 election. And I said, well, have you decided what you're going to do? And he was completely agonized, torn. Everyone in his life, they were Republican family, but all the women in his family, no, you can't vote for Donald Trump. You can't do it. He actually liked Hillary Clinton. The former secretaries of state, they spend a fair amount of time together. He had a very good relationship with her. He was completely torn. And interestingly, he ultimately voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and in 2020, and never changed his mind about him. He made a distinction in his mind. He said, well, I've never, publicly endorsed him, and I never will. He did speak out very forcefully after January 6th and after the election. He said, no evidence it was stolen. We just saw him at the beginning of this month. He's 94 years old now. He's undecided again. Now, my guess is that of the three, he's most likely this time not to vote for Trump. But it's not clear. I don't know. What did you think?
Well, I think I would just add real quickly. I think that the lesson we took from that is the power of partisan identification these days, the power of the tribe, right? We're in this moment in America where we belong to a team, us versus them, shirts versus skins. And yeah, my side may have a leader I don't think much of. He may be nuts, as Baker called him, but it's my side. And it may be hard to understand that sometimes, but I think it's important to understand that, because I think that's the reason why you see Trump with 47%, because I don't think 47% genuinely would want him had they had a genuine choice in the matter. But so I think that's why Baker matters, because it's sort of the story of the establishment Republican party of his era and how they have now become Donald Trump's party.
Of course, that means that Liz Cheney has more courage than James Baker.
Well, I mean, that's, we're going to talk to her tomorrow night about that. So Dick Cheney and Jim
Dick
Baker
Cheney,
are super good friends.
Exactly.
And and Cheney was always the right winger, as Baker would call him,
yes,
in the Bush administration. And Baker was the moderate. And Dick Cheney is the one who said, no, I'm voting for the Democrats. So it's interesting.
Right. So for this book, you interviewed Donald Trump twice. I'm fascinated by the second interview down at Mar-a-Lago, where you say he started the conversation with a lie. When I read that, I said, well, no shit, Sherlock. I mean,
Okay.
but,
Fair.
but no, I didn't mean it like that. But tell me about that interview.
Well, it was really an interesting thing. Donald Trump, right? He almost has the exact opposite approach to interviews of Kamala Harris, right? He doesn't, he's not afraid of misspeaking or, get a gaffe in an interview. First of all, he retains a belief in the magical power of his own persona, right? To persuade. So he wants to talk to anybody. In fact, the truth is that we didn't even ask for the interview, the first interview for this book. They read an article about the different books that were being written about Trump, and Peter received an email saying, well, you guys want an interview, right? And we said, okay, sure. And I kept saying, like, does he know that I'm writing the book too? And, yeah. And we flew down there. It was April of 2021, so it was during the pandemic. In fact, we had just gotten our first vaccine shots and really hadn't traveled hardly at all. And Trump at this time was still sort of in exile in Mar-a-Lago. So he was just eager to talk and to talk and to talk. And I will say that, this tendency that we observe in a very pronounced form in this election clearly was already true then. This was not an interview in a sense that you ask a question and, I give an answer. There was no, stopping him. We had a great strategy for this interview that we were going to avoid talking about the 2020 election, because then he'd go off on that and we would try to, get through our other questions first. That didn't work.
Well, I'm very familiar with that. Once I was interviewing Clinton for a series I was doing, and I got in a limousine, and it was a 50-minute ride to the airport, and I never got in one question because he knew what I wanted to talk about, and he didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, in this case, he wants to talk about what he wants to talk about. But to your point, the question, so at our first interview, we asked him, are you going to do any kind of public service announcement on the vaccine? Because it was his people that were most skeptical, and maybe he would have an ability to assure them that yes, is a safe thing. He said, yeah, I'm thinking about that. The Biden administration, they've asked me to do that. I'm thinking I might do that. Okay. And then, so the second interview is November, 7 months later. He hasn't done the PSA. And we ask him, first question is, why didn't you do that public service announcement for the vaccine you said you were going to do? And he says, what are you talking about? I'm not going to do any public. I was never going to do any public. Nobody ever asked me to do a public service announcement. We're like, where'd you get that from? We got it from you. So one way or the other, he wasn't telling the truth or forgot or whatever. But what had happened in between, this is actually instructive. He had urged people at one of his rallies to get the vaccine, and they booed him.
Right.
And they booed him. And why is that important? Because we often think that he, is leading his base, and mostly that is true. I think the base would do a lot of what would go along with him on a lot of different routes, even if he didn't always agree with himself on an issue. But in this case, he was afraid of his base. He was afraid of losing them, and this is one that was a red line he wouldn't cross.
So a few questions about how you two operate. I've written a couple of books with other people, but it was a little different. I wasn't married to anybody. How do you write together?
Well, the good news is we're still on speaking terms. So, it's, and we're planning we're working on a new book. It's a little bit hard to get much done in the context of this election. Mm-hmm. But it's, the new project is the 5 U.S. presidents who've struggled to deal with Putin. And it's really meant to be a sort of a coda to our first book together, which was about, our experience of watching Putin come to power in Russia. This is meant to be the Washington story of how we got Russia so wrong. And, if you'd asked anybody 20 years ago if Putin would still be in power, no, absolutely not. Would Russia be in this terrible war in Ukraine, the worst war since World War II? Inconceivable. But, I think that we're lucky because we started out working together, as you know.
Yeah, but you were editing him.
Some things don't change.
Do you edit her?
Yeah, but I'm a lighter touch.
She
doesn't need as much editing.
By the way, that's actually not true.
know.
The true story is that every week when I write my column, I send it to Peter and I beg him to read it before it's published on the New Yorker's website, because he always will find something, and he's the best reader. He publishes so many stories in the New York Times, he doesn't send them to me and ask me to look at them before they're published.
Yeah, but what I say every week to you is, this is great, this is perfect, you've got it just right. Which is true.
Smart man.
Actually, it happens to be true every week, which is great.
So
Can I tell one story
please.
Working together as
Yeah.
a couple? She's maybe tired of me telling this story, but our first book, as she said, was a Russia book. We were writing that book when Susan was pregnant, actually. And we had just moved home from Moscow. So she was renovating the house. We were moving home. We were starting new beats. And we were finishing this book. And we went to dinner one night. And we're walking home from dinner. And she says, I think the baby has dropped. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what that means. She says, it means we don't have much time. I'm like, okay, well, that can't be because we have 2 chapters we haven't finished yet. So we go home, we stay up all night to finish these 2 chapters. There were drafts written. And I think Susan goes up to bed maybe around 5 in the morning, and I come up around 8 in the morning, and I wake her. I say, okay, we're good. I sent them to the publisher. She says, good, I'm having contractions. Now, Well, a lot of people who are having contractions at this point might decide to call the doctor or go to the hospital. Susan decided to go to the store because we had been so busy on the book, we hadn't done any shopping, and she wasn't going to let her mother buy all the stuff for the baby. So she goes to Bye Bye Baby. And the good thing about Bye Bye, with a really good friend, the good thing about Bye Bye Baby is that they have an express line if your contractions are under 5 minutes.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it's absolutely true.
The part about the express line is
Okay,
not
not
true.
that part. That part's just I get a joke.
Okay.
But it is true. She did go to Bye Bye
Okay,
Baby, and
okay.
partly because she thought it's too good a story if she had the baby on the same day we turned in the book. But in fact, we did. We had the baby on the same day
Yeah,
we
no,
turned in the
I
book.
actually
That
drove
is a great
directly.
metaphor.
I drove directly to the hospital from the store with all the baby gear in the back seat.
They say writing a book is like having a baby, but I have to
Exactly.
say that was pushing it.
It's not the same. So one final question, since it's a night celebrating local journalism. I mean, this is a topic that, of course, we could talk about forever. But are you optimistic about the future of journalism?
Can I be optimistic?
Yeah, we're going to be optimistic. You know why? Because that baby has now grown up and has decided to become, much to our surprise, actually, a journalist himself.
That's great.
And, discovered.
He always told us he wouldn't. But yeah, no, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about journalism. I do. There is more hunger for information than ever before. There's more need for journalistic vetted information than ever before. And the expansion and explosion of the marketplace of ideas is a really wonderful, amazing thing in some ways, but it also reinforces why it matters to have professional journalists, providing fact-based, fact-checked news at a time when it matters more than ever. Now, we haven't figured out all the business modalities, and that's not for Susan and me, unfortunately.
Right.
But I just feel like, we're going to find new and different ways of telling stories. We're going to find ways of capturing those new audiences and making sure that we're essential to them. And so I am optimistic about journalism despite all of the struggles we have.
Yeah, and I would say that, for young people, I mean, it's a terribly stressful time. But the flip side is what I've observed, not just from our son, but, more broadly, working with a lot of these amazing young journalists, they're better journalists than we ever were at their age. They are able to do more with more tools at their disposal. They can harness the power of information and ideas in ways that really would not have been conceivable to us in our early 20s. And that does give me hope. I feel sorry, that we've left things in such a mess for them. But, I definitely feel like the quality of some of these young journalists is just extraordinary.
I agree. And I've always said that the formats will inevitably change. But two things that can't change are the need for humans to understand their world through story and the need for people to go out and try to find the truth. And these two are great storytellers who are out to find the truth. So thank you very much.